Hello, welcome to another video where today we're going to be at the experimental garden for probably the last time. Today I'm going to be going over some of the conclusions that I came to working on this garden for the summer. Tomorrow I'll be heading off to in-person college again, so even the little amount of maintenance that I was doing on this garden won't be possible. Now, unfortunately, this wasn't the most scientific of experiments. I ended up testing multiple variables at the same time, so take every conclusion with a grain of salt. So let's start with the initial variable I was trying to test, and that's the idea that these wild-growing nightshades would indicate favorable ground to grow other nightshades, like tomatoes and peppers. This has been thoroughly disproven. I had suspected disease was going to be a problem, and that it would limit growth somewhat. I was not prepared for just how much it was going to be a problem. Unfortunately, there's not just one disease that tomatoes and peppers can be affected by. There are dozens, and if you want to meet them all, recreate this experiment. That's a bit of an over-exaggeration, but last year in my tomato garden, I only had problems with one disease that only manifested in the later parts of the growing season. This year, I had 3, and 2 of which were right from the start. Now, the way you, ideally at least, control these diseases is by pruning the lower parts of the plant. And I'm sure you can see the problem. If you're constantly pruning the plant, it's constantly losing foliage, whether you're pruning it or it's losing it to disease, that slows the growth of the plant. These nightshades may indeed indicate good soil conditions or weather or light levels for growing other nightshades, but that doesn't matter if the plants are constantly losing foliage because of diseases that are present. So hypothesis 1 is thoroughly disproven. I kind of expected this from the second episode onward, but hey, still useful information. The second hypothesis was that this thorny fence would protect the plants from animals. And except for some caterpillars, I'm going to say that's a huge success. And I'll show you why in a second. You see where you can just sort of walk up to the fence and this San Marzano tomato is sort of peeking over? Yep, it got bit up completely, and I think that's by some browsing deer. As with everything in this garden, it's scientifically dubious, but I'm pretty sure this might be the exception that proves the rule. That this fence does wonders for protecting from larger animals. Harvests this year haven't been fantastic, but they've been better than last year. Last year, every tomato got bitten by a groundhog, chipmunk, or squirrel. This year, I only have caterpillars and slugs to deal with. And those, at the very least, I can deal with by hand. So this stuff is at the very least promising, although there is a little bit of a con that leads into my next point. As effective as this stuff might be, it's a total eyesore if it was near a house. And honestly, it can be kind of hard to get in and out of, even with this gate I set up. I don't think I've actually ever shown this. What you do is you place this right in here, and this just sort of lays here. Now, the third thing I unintentionally tested was the fact that when your garden is far away and difficult to get to, there can be problems with maintenance. So let me illustrate this problem. I often have to walk through very poor conditions when it rains, only to get really messed up by these little tear thumb plants. These are native, actually, and they're everywhere. Only to sort of walk through here, move this wineberry plant to the side that I really should have killed a long time ago, move a gate, and then walk through here, get sort of cut up even more. And now that I'm in the garden, you would think I would be just fine until I have to leave again. But this place has some of the worst mosquitoes I've ever experienced. That is not an exaggeration. Imagine having 6 of them on you at the same time, increasing minute by minute. So the problem I'm getting at is this. When it becomes an ordeal to get to the garden, sometimes you fall into a bad habit where you don't do that ordeal on a regular basis. So even when you're around to maintain the garden, you don't. For this reason, I might investigate planting live roses or other thorny plants around a garden. They'll look much nicer, and I hope they have the same effect. That's more of a long-term solution. I'm not sure I can test that in 1 year. So that's enough about the overarching conclusions. Let's talk about the individual plants now, because I have some things to say. So let's talk about these poor Cherokee purples first. Victims of their own deliciousness. It seems every time I plant these, something eats them. These plants seem disease resistant, but not disease immune. I'm actually testing that with this individual. I want to see how well it does at protecting itself without me pruning it. And not to mention the fact that these tomatoes take forever to ripen, and it typically doesn't make that many of them. So there's potential here, but it's a difficult variety in my experience. For comparison's sake, I'm going to go straight to the Black Prince tomato. This has far more problems with disease, but at the very least it pumps out more fruit, they're smaller, and it ripens them relatively quickly. I've gotten tomatoes from this plant, I haven't from the Cherokee purples. And similarly, this bell pepper does not handle adverse conditions well. I do think in a garden that has no problems, these would all be phenomenal plants, but life has problems, and these plants have not been measuring up to their counterparts. Speaking of counterparts, one that really surprised me was the Habanero, mainly for the fact that it is really good at losing leaves that are having problems, and flourishing nonetheless. Again, one individual, not the most scientific, and I'm sad that I'm probably not going to get much yield since I have to go away, but this plant surprised me. It certainly did better than these plants at responding to the adverse conditions. This plant has basically been pruning itself the entire time, which, as long as you go around and pick up the leaves, is advantageous because the leaves turn yellow beforehand, and I take that as the plant is taking back some of the nutrients from each leaf, which is better than me having to snip off entirely green sections of leaf from other plants. Very similar story with the jalapeno, but it's not dropping its leaves as readily or as efficiently, so it's not as stellar in that regard, but it recovered quite nicely, and I do think I'm going to have at least a few harvests from this plant. These San Marzano tomatoes were doing rather well. I've kind of let them go a little bit, probably should have pruned them a while ago, but I'm not sure this is a kind of disease that you can prune away, honestly. I think it's bacterial spot, and as far as I know, it will eventually just kill the plant regardless of what I do. And honestly, the main problem with this variety is that it just doesn't play well with others. They're very sprawling, they take up much more space than any other tomato plant, and they tend to make very heavy clusters of fruit that are very difficult to deal with. So another plant where the potential is there, but you really need some high maintenance for these things. And now onto the complete opposite end of the spectrum, Thai chilies. I don't know what it is about this plant, but it literally laughs off any adverse conditions that get thrown at it. It looks like recently something attacked its leaves a little bit, but more or less this thing is incognito, and the yield is getting really nice. It's had no problems with disease, growing in relative shade, and it's producing quite a few edible fruit. There's really been no issues here. The yield may look a little tiny, but each one of these peppers is enough to really knock you over, so I'm quite happy about this plant, and I'm definitely going to be planting it again. Now, I want to reiterate that this was an experiment. The experiment was not to get the most and best fruit. The experiment was, how do these plants fare in adverse conditions? And if you know in your garden you're going to be facing adverse conditions, I would highly suggest planting the habanero or the Thai chili. Obviously not scientific, I only have one of each plant, but it does seem that these varieties are very well suited to adverse conditions. Anyway, that's all for this year. I do hope you've learned as much as I have from this, and I hope you stay tuned for what I do next year. As always, I wish you the best. Till next time.